There are people who live deeply and leave almost no trace online, not because they're afraid of judgment, not because they don't have anything to say, but because somewhere, quietly, they made a decision, one their nervous system understood before their mind caught up, that the moment you frame a feeling for an audience, something essential leaves it. You probably know someone like this, or maybe you are this person. And here's what's fascinating. Psychology actually has a name for what they're protecting, and it's not shyness, it's not avoidance, it's something far more precise than that. Let me start with what this actually feels like from the inside. You're somewhere real. Something moves through you. A conversation, a view, one of those quiet moments that lands when you weren't expecting it. And almost on instinct, your hand moves toward your phone. And then, it stops. Not because you decided anything, it's more like the body already knew. Because the moment you try to translate that experience into a post, a caption, something shareable, it collapses. Like trying to describe a dream while you're still inside it. The act of documenting ends the thing you were trying to hold. So you put the phone down. You go back to being invisible. And while the rest of the world is constructing a legible version of itself, you sit with the experience. Whole. Unnamed. Wondering maybe if a life that leaves no record still counts. It counts. That's genuinely not the question. The real question is why the urge to document sometimes feels like a kind of violence against the experience itself. What psychologists describe as narrative identity, the ongoing story we tell ourselves about who we are, was never designed to be public. It was meant to be fluid. Developmental psychologist Dan McAdams spent decades mapping how humans build a coherent self through private meaning-making, integrating experience, revising old interpretations, sitting inside contradiction long enough to let it teach you something. Identity, in that model, is less a product and more a process, something still in motion. But here's the thing. Social media doesn't ask you to share your process. It asks you to arrest it. Every post is an anchor, a timestamp on a version of yourself you're now, quietly, accountable to. And the more posts accumulate, the more the archive starts to press back. Not like a gallery, more like a contract. You feel a pull to perform the person people already decided you were. The self that changed internally without announcement now has to explain itself. Their brain is like a document that's still being written, fluid, revisable, alive in draft form. But the platform demands you publish. And once you publish, edits start to feel like betrayals. The psychological cost of that isn't anxiety. It's something more specific. Identity rigidity, the quiet foreclosure of becoming someone the archive can't account for. Now, consider this for a moment. Everything we've just described, the resistance, the retreat, the refusal to document, we tend to pathologize it. We call it avoidance, social anxiety, being bad at self-promotion. But what if the diagnosis is wrong? A study published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology found that the act of photographing an experience measurably reduces how fully it's encoded in memory. The camera outsources the remembering, and the brain, sensing that, partially disengages. The people who don't post aren't losing access to their experiences. They may be the ones most fully inside them. And here's something I find genuinely worth sitting with. The most psychologically integrated people in identity research aren't the ones with the most consistent public narrative. They're the ones who've allowed their self-concept to be revised most frequently, most honestly, without the weight of a documented past demanding they stay the same. The unsearchable person isn't absent from the conversation. They're simply refusing to be pinned to a single timestamp. So what does any of this mean practically? Not as permission to disappear, more as a reframe for what's actually happening when you feel that pull away from posting. that specific heaviness. It might not be fear. It might be discernment, a recognition somewhere below conscious thought that this moment belongs to you, that converting it into content would be a transaction you haven't fully agreed to. There's a real difference between a life that's private and a life that's hidden. Privacy is active. It's a choice about what stays sovereign. The people who live without a documented archive aren't absent. They're declining to make their evolution a public performance. A life without an audience isn't a lesser life. It's a life where you remain the only author. And maybe that's the quietest radical thing here. We've built an entire cultural infrastructure around the idea that experience becomes more real when it's witnessed, that a self becomes more coherent when it's legible to others. But the research keeps pointing somewhere else. The self that's most free to grow is the one least burdened by its own documented history. Don't be afraid of being unsearchable. Be afraid of becoming so accountable to who you were that you can't become who you're turning into. Some things are too alive to be archived, and some people understand that instinctively, not as a flaw, as a form of care. The question isn't really why you resist the digital gaze. The question is, what would you allow yourself to become if you stopped asking the archive for permission? If any part of this landed, I'd genuinely like to know where. Do you find yourself protecting experiences from documentation? Or does sharing actually make them more real for you? Leave a comment. I'm curious.